Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Kamala, Shugar. I'm a Lane County Circuit Court judge. No one's introducing me, so I'll just introduce myself really briefly. I'm a double duck. I graduated from University of Oregon undergrad in journalism and political science, and then I went to law school right after that, and got a JD here. And I've been practicing law in Lane County for most of my career since 1996. And I became a circuit court judge in 2019 after I was appointed by Governor Brown. It's a general jurisdiction court, so my colleagues and I see all kinds of cases. And the reason I mention that is I'm going to talk a little bit about those different kinds of cases in just a minute. My interest in consumer protection comes from the time that I worked with the Attorney General at Oregon DOJ. And I worked with her very closely for a couple of years during the last part of my legal career before I became a judge. But I'm really excited to introduce our speakers who are here to tell you a little bit about their research and their work. I'm going to start with Dr. Miller, who's going to be your first speaker. Dr. Miller is an associate professor of economics at the University of Oregon. And he specializes in the economics of competition, public policy, and applied econometrics. Yeah, I can't even say the word econometrics. I have to practice that one. His research focuses on applying tools of industrial organization and structural econometrics.
There you go, yeah.
I have to say it twice. To policy questions across several industries, including housing, health insurance, and legal markets for sin goods, which I'll let him tell you what those are. His work has appeared in journals including the Journal of Public Economics, Review of Industrial Organization, and National Tax Journal and Health Affairs. Professor Miller is going to speak with you about, he actually is one of the recipients of the grant last year, so he's going to talk with you about the work that he did as a result of that grant project. And then I also have Blake Burrell is here, and Blake is a nonprofit administrator and public servant focused on advancing the rights of individuals experiencing homelessness in the Eugene, Springfield area. Blake's education and professional background have focused on social, scientific research, public administration, and advocacy. His most recent work has centered on increasing awareness of various human rights issues in our community and increasing awareness of barriers that are related to housing access. Blake operates under various capacities in his community to research issues impacting renters, conduct community outreach within unhoused populations, and facilitate tenant education seminars, programming to increase awareness of local renter protections, fair housing law, and landlord-tenant law. His goal is to bridge gaps within the community to educate consumers about their rights and responsibilities related to housing transactions. So before I hand it over to these incredible speakers, I wanted to give you a little bit of background and information from my work in the courts to give you some context for our conversation. So when Blake is talking with you about landlord-tenant rights and evictions, I wanted to tell you that in our court in Lane County, we had in 2019 1,756 eviction cases filed. We call them FEDs, but they basically are eviction cases. 6% of those went to trial. 49% were what we call a default, which usually means that the tenant did not appear or did not contest. And 700 were either settled or dismissed, which is 39%. So keep these numbers in mind. 6% went to trial, 50% defaulted or failed to appear, and 40% were settled or dismissed. Now, in 2020, in contrast with the 1,756 filed in 2019, in 2020, we had a moratorium on a lot of evictions that were happening. And there were 517 cases filed, much like less than a third. In 2021, also during that time, between 20 and 21, we had rental assistance started to come into play, as well as increased tenants' rights were infused into the statutes. In 2021, 623 cases were filed. And then in 2022, after the moratorium was lifted, while the laws still for tenants' rights stayed in place and some of the increased tenant representation through legal aid was still in place, 1,445 cases were filed. So almost all the way back up to the number from 2019. But the biggest change, there were more trials. 9% of those cases went to trial instead of 6. 577 or 39, so 40% of the cases were defaulted. Remember in 2019 it was 50%. So down to 40% were defaulted or failed to appear. And this number goes up. 50% were either settled or dismissed. So there has been a shift. It'll be interesting to see in 23, 24, whether that trend continues with increased renters' rights, the laws that have changed, as well as increased legal representation. Because most of the people that I see in these cases come to court with no lawyer. And then very quickly, I will not take as long on this one, property foreclosure. Some of you might have been at the last session. In 2019, 121 property foreclosure cases were filed. The majority of those cases are defaulted. In 2020, during the moratorium, only 51. In 2021, 18. And then in 2022, it only went up to 32 cases. So something has changed in that realm. Property foreclosure cases have not bounced back like the FEDs have. So those are my stats for you. I'm happy to answer questions, but I really want to save the majority of our time for our speakers. And so I'll ask Dr. Miller to speak first.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone here. Thank you for your interest. Thanks to the law school for inviting me. And I just, thinking about those numbers, very early in my career as a graduate student, I worked on a project trying to estimate the value of civil courts at the state level. This is a contract from the National Center for State Courts. And behind those numbers, each one of those cases represents real effort invested in our legal and justice system to adjudicate those things, to process those things. And so thanks to you and your colleagues and all the staff and all the real human effort involved in doing all of that. So it's important to remember behind the statistics that there are human lives going on here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about a project that I have been working on along with my student and co-author, Edward Martinez-Lazo, that was funded by the Oregon Consumer Financial Protection Grant. The project is called Protecting Consumers in Mortgage Markets, the Effects of Mortgage Servicer Licensing. And the motivation is sort of, the big picture here is that mortgage markets are markets that many people engage with throughout their lives. They have very substantial effects on households. Or when you own a house or you own some real estate, it's generally the biggest thing on your household balance sheet. It drives decisions to invest or save for years, and it's where people get a huge amount of their value. At the same time, it's a market that people participate in relatively infrequently. So unlike the grocery store where you're going a couple times a week, you have a really good idea what's a deal at Market Choice or at Safeway. You don't have any idea what's going on in the real estate market because you check in with it maybe a couple times during your lifetime, and there's all of these intermediaries that are engaging in the transaction. And that's not just the real estate agents, that's the title company, it's escrow, it's all the banks involved and so on. And throughout this entire system, there are a lot of misaligned incentives. Different actors they're all trying to extract their little piece of the pie, and that adds up to a lot of friction between two people that just want to, exchange a house for some money, something like that, which feels like a really challenging thing to do. So we're zooming in and looking at a particular part of this equation with this grant. We're focusing on mortgage servicers, and these are firms that collect payments, they pursue delinquencies, they do other, sort of the mechanism of the financial aspects of the mortgage. And this is a relatively new phenomenon in the last couple of decades in the United States. It used to be that the bank that you got your loan from would service that loan directly, but with the advent of mortgage-backed securities and the broader just securitization of the mortgage market, the person who's actually, or the firm that's collecting the money, usually is somebody that the lendee has never heard of, had no choice over, and they yet have a big impact on their experience of having a mortgage, and can influence, things like being current on payments. If they don't do their jobs correctly, if they don't post the payments correctly, those kinds of things, it can lead to real trouble. So it's a source of friction, and particularly during the mortgage, housing, and financial crisis leading into the Great Recession, there was a lot of concern about this industry that kind of sprung up without much oversight, and there were a lot of anecdotes, certainly about problems in this industry. So in the post crisis era, there's kind of been two sets of changes that have happened. One has been at the federal level. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at the federal level established sort of standards for here is how a mortgage servicer has to talk to consumers. Here is what they have to tell them, and here is how they have to do their work on the back end to make sure that the money gets transferred to the right account in the right bank and all that kind of stuff. But they didn't really do anything about, how do you become a mortgage servicer? There's not a lot of enforcement teeth there. It's just sort of standards. And the enforcement level and the licensing happens at the state level, if it happens at all. And many states don't have any licensing requirements for mortgage servicers at all. So to take Oregon's licensing law as an example, Oregon's law establishes balance sheet and liquidity requirements to make sure they can actually sort of fund all these operations. There is an examination to be a mortgage servicer, or to be the registered agent for the mortgage servicer. You have to have someone working physically in the state that the state regulator can go and talk to and say you've done a bad job, or presumably they do something like that. And then it establishes state-level processes for investigating complaints and enforcing the standards and the licensing requirements. And so we are thinking about this from the perspective of costs and benefits. We're economists. This is what we do. What is the impact of these things? When you impose licensing requirements in any kind of industry, it acts as both a barrier to entry, but it also can resolve asymmetric information, right? When you're a consumer trying to buy a house, you have no idea what's going to happen with your mortgage, and maybe you're going to get a mortgage servicer that treats you very badly. So establishing licensing requirements can raise that minimum bar of quality. On the other hand, it's unclear the extent to which consumers as a group really value that quality, and it could be the case that the costs imposed on the firms through the regulatory action may be high enough that those costs then get passed through to consumers in the form of higher interest rates or higher fees or something like that, which then is going to trickle down to the rest of the housing industry. I realize it's dangerous as an economist to use the phrase trickle down, but it is a natural metaphor in this case, and there's lots of research showing that fees and things like that do in fact pass through to consumers ultimately. So it's empirically ambiguous. We don't know a priori what's going to happen when we impose these things. And so in our research we take advantage of the fact that states around the country rolled out these standards over a period of many years to try and understand what the effect of these standards are. And so we're using a modern research method, research design in econometrics, and I'm so sorry that I made you say that twice. I just copied and pasted, did not realize you were going to have to say it out loud. I just thought it was going on one page somewhere. Yes, but we use a technique that's designed to compare places where policy changes did not happen to places where the policy changes did happen, and takes advantage of the difference in timing to understand the effect there. So this is like a little schematic graph where you can say, hey, look, something jumps up. There's an effect of this policy change. So what we did in the research, and it's ongoing, the grant extends through June of next year, and so we're continuing to refine our results. But our preliminary results, we look at a lot of outcomes in the mortgage industry, including delinquency rates, foreclosures, interest rates of new loans. So we're trying to see whether or not these costs get passed through to consumers and so on, and all of those things remain unchanged. And so this is maybe good news if you are a consumer advocate that these licensing requirements are not generating substantial costs that are passing through to consumers. The flip side of that is that you can also take a look at complaints, both for mortgage servicers directly and also things like the way that mortgage servicers report credit information to the consumer credit bureaus, and we find that there does not really seem to be any change going on there too. So like, if this is what a graph would look like if there was an effect, here's what our graphs actually look like, and you can just sort of see visually that there's really not much going on there. The lines don't seem to be jumping very much. Maybe a little tiny bit on the left, but it's not statistically significant, a phrase we love to use in econometrics. So what does this mean? This is a sort of a no news is not necessarily good or bad news. No news is no news. So it's not really impacting consumers in the sense of higher costs, but they're also not necessarily getting the benefits of having this licensing authority that is able to process complaints and things like that. And so this to me really opens a policy question for the Oregon legislature and other legislatures around the country that have passed these laws, which is, look, if you really want to do something here, there's probably more room to tighten the standards or to increase enforcement. Whether that means you need to staff up your agencies. I know a lot of state agencies around the country are really feeling the bite of staffing right now and have been for the last couple of years, or it's what are the penalties involved to change the calculus for servicers. That's up to them. But there does seem to be more room to have action there to get some kind of movement there. So I'll leave the time there. I'm very interested in having time for Q&A later.
I have a question.
Fantastic.
Just a clarification.
Yes.
So when you say complaints,
Yes.
Are you tracking what is the nature of the complaints?
Yes, so we are able to track that sort of minimally. There's like some categorization. That's something we need to continue to drill down into because a lot of times this data is, to use a technical term, dirty. Because often it's like it's text and you have to kind of parse it out. So if there are particular kinds of complaints we're interested in, that would be very interesting to me to know what we should be looking for.
Well, I was trying to figure out if there was any way to draw a nexus between the complaints and the licensure.
Yes. So what we're doing is we're asking, at the point when these laws go into force, and these laws go into force, and all the servicers have to then obtain a license or stop doing business in the state. So we're asking, does the overall number of complaints that are received by the state regulator or the national regulator, does that number go down after the licensing takes effect?
But when you go to your policy implications page, your question is, do we increase penalties for violations of standards? And the other question maybe that is a possible question is, are the standards for licensing the right standards?
Yeah, exactly. It is different. It is absolutely the broader question. It sort of nests what I threw up there as just a possible thing you could think to do. It's a question, I think, of both what should the standards be, that normative question, and then also how do you set up the enforcement system and staff it and give it the resources it needs to have bite. Because there's a lot of these things that ultimately don't have very much effect for that reason.
So my last question for you, and then we're going to go to Blake, is what is your research going to continue to do between now and the end of the project? So between now and the end of the project, our big primary push was over the summer when I wasn't teaching and neither Ed or I were teaching. Between now and the end of the project, we were interested in getting a lot of feedback from people that are involved in these things, like you on the other end, diving a little bit deeper into some of the complaint data, diving a little bit deeper into some of the outcome data that we think we might be able to get a more, try to get some heterogeneity. Is it maybe it's not having an effect on the market overall, but maybe it's having a particular effect in particular geographies,
in low-income areas or for borrowers that have worse credits, those kinds of things.
Okay.
Those are breakouts that we think are potentially possible with the data that we have, the data that's released by federal regulators and so on, but it's a little trickier to tease all those things apart. So basically it's, more. dive a little bit deeper.
Great. Well, thank you. Now I'll just ask Blake to take it away.
Absolutely.
All right.
We need to get the...
Oh, we have to pull up your
absolutely.
PowerPoint.
Great. Well, while you're getting that set up, I guess I can start by just introducing myself. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. I actually have a lot of follow-up questions, some ideas of where we need to share that in the community. So as you introduced me, my name is Blake Burrell. I'm a programs administrator for a local social service and emergency service nonprofit. And I serve in various capacities throughout the community, working with the City of Eugene's Human Rights Commission, various task force and work groups with Lane County, as well as some private sector collaboration with the City of Eugene's Chamber of Commerce. So my work as a homeless and emergency services professional has provided me a lot of insight and experience working with individuals who are unhoused and residing within the municipal jurisdiction of Eugene, but Lane County abroad. So when I'm talking today, I think a lot of what I'm thinking about is a practitioner and a person in the public sector who is trying to interpret and apply what laws and policies are being passed and communicate that to individuals who are going to be directly impacted by these policies. So this presentation is going to be focusing on increasing access to housing with information about rights, consumer protections, and tenant education information for individuals and families experiencing homelessness in our community. So a little beepy noise. We'll see if that works. We'll get some technical assistance.
Yeah.
Oh, no problem. I can stand. Zip it down. Oh, there we go. There we go. Thank you so much. Step one in this process, I think, is understanding the consumer. So as policies and regulations are brought out, I think often we can be stuck in the weeds and the high-level thinking of these issues without addressing who the consumer that's being impacted is. So what I want you to know, and the philosophy that I'll be speaking from today, is that I do fundamentally believe that housing is a human right. So when I talk about individuals experiencing homelessness, I'm talking about a consumer that I do personally and philosophically believe should have access to stable and adequate housing. There's a whole school of thought around this, if you've read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that specifically addresses housing as being a fundamental human right within a democratic society. So what this means, the simple idea that everyone deserves to have access to fulfill basic human needs such as food, clothing, housing, healthcare, services, and social security. And this means no matter who they are, where they come from, what happened to them, or what they've done. So when we think of the unhoused population, you have to address and think critically about these consumers and identify that these are individuals where these rights have been routinely, access to those rights have been routinely denied. And we have municipal strategies and public sector strategies to provide assistance, to provide those resources, and we invest a lot of public dollars into trying to make sure people have access to these resources. So today, we will be discussing homelessness and housing in that relationship. So one of the first things I want to do is ask this rhetorical question, and I want you all to think about, when I say homelessness, what comes to your mind? You don't have to answer that, but just think about it. So for the past 2.5, 3 years, I've been leading an internship program here at the School of Law, and I have students participate in my tenant education program that I administer 3 times a year to individuals throughout the community. And students, when they come into my program, I ask this question to them. What do you think? What comes to mind? And what I often find is that students describe characteristics associated with the experience of homelessness. However, these characteristics are characteristics of the experience, not character traits of the individuals. And making that distinction is really important before we even start to talk about this and start to talk about how do these consumers access housing and how do we communicate about them. So if you're thinking about homelessness, you have to ask yourself, is this a character trait or is this a condition of being? When we talk about why this matters and what does this mean is because the way that we tell the story, the way that we talk about unhoused populations, words tell a story, stories shape attitudes, and attitudes shape policy. And those policies directly impact what consumer protections are put in place and how those individuals are experiencing the world around us. So this isn't a new concept. We use words to describe housing status every day. You might recognize some of these. Homeowner, landlord, renter, property manager, at-risk renter, maybe someone experiencing homelessness, right? So there are many, many, many words that you need to know about experiencing homelessness, and I will not go into every acute aspect of every definition, but I want you to know that there is a lot of language to describe where, or better, how individuals live. So you'll see terms like sheltered, unsheltered, literally homeless, how long those individuals have lived in this condition. So this might be chronic homelessness 1 or 2, or episodic homelessness, and how much autonomy or choice an individual has about where and how they can live. If you've looked at our recent case in grants past, this definition of involuntary homelessness has come up. These definitions really matter because what we're doing in the social scientific paradigms and the municipal paradigms is we're creating a new nomenclature for a social group. These distinctions lay the ground in social nomenclature that can either amplify or exclude that social group. And thinking about that narrative of exclusion is really important whenever you start to talk about consumer protections, because we're talking about housing status. We're talking about a distinct social group with complex social identities. And we have to make considerations for every dimension of those individual social identities if we're going to talk about that social group and how they're engaging with the market. So I lay this all out because we know that our complex and intersectional identities have to navigate the world all the time. And when you're an individual who's experiencing homelessness, you're navigating new social systems, new institutional systems, while operating in a condition where you might not have access to those daily needs. Again, to my interns, I asked this question: how many of you woke up in a bed this morning? How many of you had a cup of coffee this morning? How many of you used the restroom today? Did you have to ask anyone to access any of those resources? Did you feel like there was a barrier between you and that cup of coffee? And if you didn't, you're existing in a paradigm that is different from an individual experiencing homelessness. And you have to think about what navigating the world from that paradigm looks like and feels like. And understand that sometimes individuals operating in this paradigm are not in a headspace, they're not in a place, they're not in a realm where they're equipped with legal education, institutional exposure, or social networks to navigate these barriers. So we have to think about this intersection of identity before we even start talking about this consumer population. And we have to understand that this group does experience marginalization and discrimination. That's not an opinion, that's not conjecture. This is a graph from the city of Eugene that was presented at a Human Rights Commission meeting last month that talks about bias trends against members of the unhoused community within the city of Eugene, within this jurisdiction. So we know that this is a group that is having a challenge accessing these systems and that is facing harassment, discrimination, criminal activity on a routine basis. And if we can acknowledge that this identity group is having barriers to access, we can start to understand, okay, this influences not only their access to these institutions that guide them and serve them, but if you have barriers to that institution, you're going to have a barrier to housing. And if you have a barrier to housing, you're going to have a barrier to accessing basic human rights, being able to do things that dignify you, make you feel free to dream. I work with individuals on a daily basis that have gone through this process of dehumanization, that have gone through this process where there are so many institutional barriers to accessing knowledge about their rights, to accessing basic services that they need. And it's really challenging. It's really challenging to talk to someone and see them try to navigate a world that they just don't have fair access to. So when I talk about barriers, I talk a lot from a public health paradigm. I studied under a scholar, Dr. Cameron Hay Rollins, just an amazing academic. If you ever get a chance to read her work in global health, she's just fantastic. And when I talk about barriers, what I'm really talking about are obstacles where within social structures or social institutions may harm or prevent a person or household from meeting their basic human needs. So when I use that term, it's a very specific language to describe all of these. So we're talking about eviction, landlord references, debt, rental history, criminalization, the list goes on and on. These are all barriers to accessing the housing market that individuals who are unhoused are experiencing. What are some really big barriers here? Institutional trauma and fatigue, housing costs, and availability and housing supply. So when we're thinking about addressing these barriers, we have programs for nutrition access, we have housing access programs, we have mental health care access, we have financial access programs. We need to be thinking about be aware of barriers that associate with consumer protections laws. Because when I teach that course, there are individuals who I am presenting information they've never heard even after 10, 20 years within the housing industry, and they say, wow, I didn't know I had that right. I didn't know that that was illegal. I didn't know that that happened to me. I'm sure that you see this all the time with individuals that come in, and that lack of knowledge surrounding those rights, that is a huge factor in homelessness. When someone faces discrimination or their rights aren't preserved in a consumer housing transaction, individuals become homeless. And whenever an individual becomes homeless, that episode statistically increases their likelihood for chronic homelessness. If an individual experiences chronic homelessness, it's so hard to get them out of the crisis response system, not to mention the layers and layers of trauma associated with that condition, and the inability to access resources that they need to move into a new housing status and a new paradigm. So understanding the context of the community is really important. So I will breeze through statistics because we all we have some association with this community, and we can recognize that homelessness is not rare and brief. It's commonly occurring, and it's throughout our community and throughout our country. Lane County has a huge issue with increase in our homelessness population. The amount of individuals entering into homelessness is surpassing the amount of people exiting shelter. I pulled these statistics this morning. So when we're looking at this, we have, and my eyes are not good, we have 4,563 people in Lane County as of September 2023. This past month, 758 entered homelessness and 321 left homelessness, right? And those exits aren't exits into housing. Those might be exits into alternative shelter, emergency shelter, or transitional housing opportunities. That doesn't mean that they have stable housing. That just means that they're somewhere that is a little bit more stable than where they just were. So what does that mean in the context of City of Eugene? 74% of those individuals live in Eugene. So when we're looking at this, 3,376 unhoused people are within a city of 178,000 people, accounting for roughly 2% of our population. So 2 in every 100 people that live in this jurisdiction are experiencing homelessness. That doesn't talk about those individuals that are at risk of homelessness. There's way more. So we are, as service providers, trying to build structurally resilient systems that address challenges and barriers to exiting homelessness. A few ways we do this are addressing those barriers through assistance programs. A way that I've been doing this is increasing access to assistance and education on protections law. So when you can start to understand what the community needs, you can start to really dive into the nuances of advocating for policy reform, advocating for new legal challenges. So local municipalities identify needs of consumers in their jurisdiction through surveys, listening sessions, outreach and tabling, work groups, panels, and committees. I engage in all of these spaces on a routine basis. When we're talking about the City of Eugene, I want to focus on one particular case, which some of you may have exposure to, where one of those committees did result in major policy changes. So the City of Eugene had a Renters Protection Committee that was appointed by the Housing Policy Board through 2019 through 2021, a group of individuals who had professional, educational, and lived experience that came together and said, we know that there are barriers to housing. There are barriers to housing attainment, maintenance, and retention. What are we going to do about it? How do we start to advocate for new policies? So those individuals put out a survey and started to learn what are renters experiencing in our community? What's happening? We know that people are saying we have these barriers that we're not able to access or afford housing, but really what does this mean? They found trends in availability, affordability, quality, access, and stability. There are individuals who express deep emotions about being stressed, having anxiety, feeling financially stuck, or humiliated. This study was conducted through the City of Eugene, and recommendations were made to City Council, and they passed rental protections. So if you live in our community, you can see we have 2 new ordinances in City of Eugene, local codes, and those codes are specifically focused on rental protections. And you can read through the list. There's a lot of different things that these rental protections are addressing. The new rental protections are addressing explicit power imbalances between consumers and property owners. And I really think that's why I'm here today, is to identify that there is power imbalance within our community. There is a power imbalance that is deeply impacting a marginalized group within our community, and those individuals do not have protections. We do not have a protected class status in the City of Eugene that goes beyond criminal offenses. So when someone faces bias in a housing transaction or employment, they can be told you're being rejected and for anything associated with that housing status, right? So we can see this. This is explicit. What are we doing about it? These are things that we've been working on within the Human Rights Commission and specifically our homelessness and poverty work group. And we're thinking about all of these barriers and where do we start addressing barriers, right? Our hopes is to mitigate the implications of institutional fatigue and trauma, housing costs, availability of housing supply. So our goal would be that we see these numbers flip-flop, that we're not seeing as many people, more people entering into homelessness as are exiting homelessness. Understanding that there are times of year where these numbers vary. We know that more people are entering into homelessness than are being housed, and that our crisis response system is strapped. So we have to understand how to promote access within our community and really think about how are we sharing these narratives, how are we sharing this with individuals who are experiencing homelessness in our space and in our community. So when we look at accessibility, it's really important to think about what barriers exist, look at definitions of accessibility and make sure that they're culturally responsive, and make sure that we're addressing the systems in which humans are navigating, and really ask ourselves, we have a crisis response system, is it being utilized? Are the dollars that we're spending on this actually being utilized in a manner that we intend them to be used for? Have we designed?
I'm just going to point out we have 5 minutes for the whole,
Okay.
left in our whole session.
Okay.
So if you want time for questions.
Okay. I'll breeze through and thank you for that note.
Sure.
And I'm happy to stay and chat with anyone afterwards if we get to that. So when we're thinking about accessibility in a social care environment, we make 5 considerations: affordability, availability, accessibility, accommodation, and acceptability. These are really important statutes to think about in a social care environment. And whenever we're thinking about how local municipalities do this, how do we educate our consumers on new protections, on their rights, we hire new staff. We do outreach and training. We do promotion. The City of Eugene has created new processes and procedures. They've created websites and social media marketing. They've done provider outreach and training. How do providers increase this information and awareness? We build relationships with people. We think about cultural sensitivity. We think about how to engage with a population who's being marginalized, talk about their life, talk about things that are very private and impacting their everyday. And then I personally lead tenant education. That tenant education piece has been really, really important and really effective at housing individuals. So when we, and I promise I won't talk forever, but when we think about this issue and we think about how do we increase access, I want all of you to think, okay, how do we start? How do we start to make connections between the legal policy space, which I assume many of you exist within, to individuals that are actually being impacted by those laws? That's hard. That's hard to do. Because how many of you know how to walk out and talk to someone, whether that's appropriate, have that conversation, dive in? The answer to that isn't very complicated. We have a network. We have a network of professionals. I've been building those relationships with individuals in this department for over 2 years. There's legacies of individuals in our community that connect with legal professionals. Draw on your educational institutions, draw on organizations and municipal partners, and talk to populations that you intend to serve. And that's really what I want to highlight and what I want you to take away from this conversation is any of you in this space that are interested in housing, interested in promoting rights of individuals experiencing housing, go connect, plug in, and talk to individuals' lived experience, listen and validate that lived experience, because there's so much work to be done, and yeah, it's very important in our community. So, thank you for your time.
I have a million questions, but I want to open it up to the audience to see if anyone has questions for either of our panelists. And if you don't, I have plenty. Anyone? All right, so one of my questions, I think, Blake, I want to thank you for your reminders about all of the different sort of ways that we think about people who are unhoused and their situation. And I also want to ask the question, how would this be different if our vacancy rate was better? How would this be different if we had greater availability?
Mm-hmm.
And while I think all of those pieces are important, I feel like that's our number one barrier to housing.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
And I could talk about that for hours, but I think when we really look at vacancy, supply is the answer. We're operating in an environment that is plagued by scarcity, but regulating that supply is what got us here in the first place. So we wouldn't be where we're at if we had things like those rental protections for the past 20 years. And development trends and the cost of development, it's hard to run properties. I work in an organization that has 1,600 units of affordable housing, okay? I understand that. I understand what it takes to do property management. Those regulations need to be in place before that market gets saturated. So preventative work, not reactionary work, which is the ecosystem that we're currently within.
Professor Miller, do you want to ring in on that?
Sure, I think, the housing market responds to supply and demand conditions just like every other market does. There's nothing magic about it there. I think that we have a lot of well-intended laws around housing, and particularly in Oregon, that have the effect of artificially restricting our housing supply. And to the extent that we can do things that increases development, as much as that is anathema to some people, you're not going to sit with your current housing stock and somehow everything's going to go away. You need to build. The humans are here, and it's hard to find places for them to be if there aren't enough places for them to be. So as a community, as a government, as a policy-oriented people, we need to think about how we can encourage those things, encourage development in ways that are in accordance with our values, our normative frameworks, of course. But you got to build.
Any thoughts or responses from the audience on our discussion? When we were meeting before the presentation, we had a great conversation of the impact of Airbnb as a market factor in available rentals, and whether it has, the phenomenon of Airbnb, whether that has reduced available rentals in our communities. So I'll just leave that with all of you because it's 2:15 and I want you to be able to go to the next session. But thank you very much.